Good afternoon and welcome back to INSA's week-long New IC Empowering Women and Engaging Men Virtual Symposium. Today's session is the keynote with Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien. Before we begin, we'd like to share a video from today's session sponsor, Mantech.
Massive cyber attack on the nation's financial institutions.
Now please welcome INSA Executive Vice President John Doyen.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth day of our new IC program. The past week has been truly outstanding. We've heard from female trailblazers who broke barriers to get their proverbial seat at the table. On Tuesday, government and industry leaders shared details on DEI programs and policies that build off these hard-fought gains and are expanding access of opportunities to even more underrepresented minorities. And yesterday's focus was on empowering our future female leaders in ways organizations are using mentorship to retain talent and drive diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, we're pleased to have with us Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien, who will share stories from her career journey, including key decisions and opportunities, steps the Air Force is taking to prioritize the recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce, and her thoughts on the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion with mission success. And former PDDNI and 2021 Baker Award honoree Sue Gordon will be the moderator today, and I know we're in for a treat. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we encourage your participation, so please submit your questions through the questions box on the right side of your screen. Also, we're excited to be joined by members of the press for today's webinar, and this is a reminder that this program is on the record. We also encourage you to share top takeaways from the program on social media using hashtag #TheNewIC. And finally, I'd like to thank all our sponsors for their critical support of this program. We could not deliver this kind of premier programming without the support of our many partners. Now I'm pleased to welcome Doreen Fresher, Executive Director for Business Development, Air Force Combatant Commands and International at Mantech, who will introduce our moderator. Doreen, over to you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. Mantech is proud to sponsor this program once again. We believe our diverse workforce is our competitive advantage, and programs like this help to advance our corporate values. Mantech is committed to working across the board with college internships and STEM programs, and really getting the best and the brightest, so that we have a long-term commitment from a lot of these, from high school all the way up to and through and after college. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator and keynote speaker. Our moderator, the Honorable Sue Gordon, is one of our country's most accomplished national security leaders. Her 3 decades of public service culminated with her tenure as PDDNI from 2017 to 2019. She has received many honors throughout her career, including being named the 2021 recipient of INSA's William Oliver Baker Award. Our keynote speaker, Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien, is the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for ISR and Cyber Effects Operations. In this capacity, she is responsible to the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force for policy formulation, planning, evaluation, oversight, and leadership of Air Force ISR and cyber effects operations capabilities. She leads 6 directorates and supports a 73,000-person intelligence and cyber operations enterprise with a portfolio valued at over $72 billion. Welcome, General O'Brien.
Thanks, Doreen. I really appreciate that. And thanks to Mantech for sponsoring. And thanks to INSA for the invitation to speak to everybody today, and to Sue for moderating. I've been tuning in to some of the earlier panels when I can this week, and I'm a little intimidated. I'm following some truly amazing women, or sharing the platform with a truly amazing woman with some really impressive resumes. But these discussions about diversity are incredibly important, and I would say perhaps especially important for the Intel community, where the consequences of groupthink as a result of the lack of diversity, those consequences could be catastrophic. Diversity is a national security imperative. It's a quality that can give us an advantage over our competitors, and I don't think you'd be listening today if you didn't believe that. So I'm not going to talk anymore about why we need diversity. Instead, I want to briefly focus on a few things I've learned from my own experiences, from seeking out emerging research across many fields of study, and by just listening to others. So I think it might be helpful if I talk for about 10 minutes or so and suggest some ways that we could get better at how we can create the conditions to interrupt the biases that are interfering with our efforts to achieve more diverse workplaces. Can I have my slide, please? I only have one slide, so bear with me. First, let me share some things that aren't in my official biography that you didn't hear in my introduction. At various times over the past 30 years, these things have all resulted in having to navigate stereotypes, which has impacted my personal and professional decisions. This is my big, wonderful family on vacation together. So I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm a stepmom, I'm a mother-in-law, and I'm a grandmother. So over my career, my marital and maternal status has varied. I've been single, I've been married to another airman, I've been divorced, I'm married to a Marine, I've been a geographic single parent, I'm a wife now with a civilian stay-at-home spouse, my Marine retired, and we're going to be empty nesters this fall. Looking back, as my status changed, I recognized I experienced bias associated with each status and the change of status. I relied on almost every form of childcare, a private caregiver in her home, daycare center, live-in foreign au pairs from 4 different countries, American live-in nanny, before and after school care, and I say almost every kind of childcare. I could never get off the military child developmental center, our daycare waiting list, even as a commander in a dual military family. Each form of childcare presented different challenges, and our military requirements, which aren't that different than many civilian requirements for temporary travel or relocating to new places or new countries, meant that we, and especially my kids, were constantly having to adapt. You know, for example, in 4th grade, my daughter said, "Mom, I do not want to teach another au pair how to speak English. I need somebody who can help me with my science project." So, okay, that's enough of the slide. If you'll take it down, please. So early in my career, and certainly before the book Lean In was published, I don't think we had a good lexicon to talk about gender and racial bias that resulted in the barriers for women and minorities. That's definitely changing now. But what I found myself doing was using the scientific method approach. Probably not surprising given my chemistry background. So refresher for those who might not be STEM, make an observation, ask a question, form a hypothesis, or something you can test, make a prediction, test the prediction, and then iterate. Let me give you an example, and this is going way back, but it has been something that I've repeated throughout my career. When I was at the Air Force Academy, I was sitting next to someone in professional military studies, and I got a B+ on my test, and he got an A. And so the teacher's kind of going over the results, and he's saying, "Well, you needed this." And I'm looking at my friend next to me, and like, "Well, I said that." And then this, I'm like, "Well, I said that too." Well, and this, I said all those things. I said, I don't understand why you got an A and I got a B. And so I experimented. I dropped Mary from when I would write my name on my quizzes or my tests, and I just wrote M. O'Brien. And that seemed to have a little bit of effect. But then when I noticed, it kind of happened again, is I still wrote, and I wrote like a girl. I wrote in feminine cursive. And I switched. I said, well, only difference this time is you print. You write in block text. And I changed. I said M. O'Brien, and I wrote in block text. And my GPA went up on the subjective classes with short answer essay tests. So you can see why I might have been attracted to chemistry, where it was either right or it's wrong. Today, all these years later, I find myself borrowing from my intelligence and military training, whether that's analytic tradecraft, whether it's the military decision-making process or root cause analysis. All of these things rely on critical thinking skills. Frame the problem, identify the assumptions. I'll come back to assumptions. Test the assumptions, analyze your data, form judgments, and assess it, and so on. I find this approach very useful in my day job with ISR and cyber. I find it very useful in the work I'm doing with the Women's Initiative team in our 9 line of efforts to reduce barriers, especially the part about testing assumptions. I found that there's a whole bunch of myths and stereotypes out there that people believe are facts about women in the workplace. One of the myths, women can't negotiate, we're poor negotiators, or we'd be able to close the pay gap. Women lack confidence, or we would put our names in the hat for senior jobs. Women are too risk averse to put into these high stake jobs, or women choose to dial back their career goals if they have children. It turns out none of these myths, none of these assumptions are backed up by science. One of my favorite articles on this topic is a Harvard Business Review article from the May-June 2018 edition. It's titled, "What Most People Get Wrong About Men and Women." It turns out that their research has shown that thriving in the workplace is linked to a couple factors. There's probably many, but I'm just going to talk about the 3 in that article. Being connected to the information networks. Like, for example, having advanced knowledge of a career-enhancing opportunity so that you're prepared to throw your name in the hat for it, to even know that that job was open before all of a sudden they announce that somebody's been hired for it, and you never even knew that, that you could have had an opportunity to compete for it. Another factor is not being judged or penalized disproportionately harshly for mistakes, either your own or perhaps mistakes made by another woman. Perhaps you've heard something I've heard in the past. This woman failed. She failed, so we can never put a woman in that job again, right? Or you made a mistake, and instead of learning from it, you don't get a second chance. Whereas a peer who's male, okay, that was a learning opportunity, let's move on. And they get told, just don't make that mistake again. And third, receiving timely and constructive feedback. In this article and some others, it talks about women frequently do not receive useful feedback. We receive, you're doing fine. You're like, how am I doing? Oh, you're doing fine. Fine does not give you the information that you need to grow and develop for the next level. And sometimes, people, well, why can't you give the accurate feedback? Well, I'm afraid a woman will cry, right? This is ridiculous. You have to know what you're doing so that you can improve. If you don't have an environment, if the organization that you're in doesn't create an environment for women to succeed equally, the failure to succeed gets attributed to the woman instead of the different environmental conditions they face. This is somewhat of a pet peeve of mine, and I frequently say, stop trying to fix women and start fixing your policies and your practices. And how would you do that? right? In order to start fixing our organizations and reducing bias, we're going to need data. Just like we need good data for analysis, COA development, intelligence assessments, we don't want bias in our intel assessments that come out of the IC. We should do everything we can to reduce bias in our hiring processes, in our evaluation systems, in our day-to-day practices, who gets, the visible assignments and who gets what's called housekeeping assignments that don't lead to recognition and future success, or reduce bias in our promotion policies. I'll be honest, I am not a huge fan of unconscious bias awareness training. I am already very, very, very aware of the bias that I've experienced. Instead, I want tools. I want tools that I can use, that I can share with others to make things better. Another article that I find really helpful from the Harvard Business Review from the November-December 2019 edition was titled, "How the Best Bosses Interrupt Bias on Their Teams." This gave some great recommendations for interrupting the bias. I want to stop the bias. I want to mitigate the bias. And you can find a free toolkit at a webpage, biasinterrupters.org. We don't have enough time for me to go into the details now, but I really encourage you to check that out because it gives some specific practices that we could put into a place. And so you might say, well, who should be using these toolkits, right? Just women, just minorities? And no, these toolkits do include everything from tracking who does the interrupting in meetings and who gets interrupted, to techniques for scheduling meetings and scheduling meetings inclusively, perhaps by sticking to working hours and locations instead of golf courses or football games, or after most daycare centers start charging you $10 a minute if you're late picking up your child. There's many other very practical, easy to implement ideas at biasinterrupters.org. I want to be thought of as a best boss, and I hope everyone does, right? I hope everyone would want to be considered a best boss. It's going to take everyone to make the progress that we need to make. So this brings me to allyship. The last article that I'll recommend today is one I just read in February this year. I've shared it with our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown. I've shared it with our Vice Chief. I've shared it with quite a few. It's titled, "Male Allyship is About Paying Attention." And it provides recommendations for men who, if you ask them, will absolutely say and believe that they support gender inclusion and equity. But they may struggle to actually see the gender discrimination and perhaps harassment that many women experience day to day. So it gives some tips for men to improve their situational awareness by noticing nonverbals. Who isn't laughing at a joke? Who is in the meeting compared to who should be in the meeting? Who's sitting at the table compared to who's standing or sitting along the wall or in the back? Who's speaking most of the time? Who's recognized by their title? The Honorable Sue Gordon, Dr. Jones, General Smith, and who's being called by their first name, Mary? By the way, there's a new term for this that shows up on Twitter and memes, and it's called untitling, kind of adding that to terms like mansplaining or heap-heating, things that are coming from research kind of into pop culture. So in closing, we already have or we're training our workforce in the critical thinking skills that we use to be great at our jobs in the intelligence community or the national security arena. Now we need to use these critical thinking skills in a different domain, a diversity domain perhaps. And we need to do it together. And it's going to take all of us. And so again, thanks for the invitation to speak. And I look forward to hearing the questions in the dialogue.
Mary, I wish we were on tape delay because your comments were so thoughtful that I was lost in them. Actually, what they were candid and they were practical and they were human. And I can't think of any 3 attributes of a better boss than those 3.
Oh,
So just really, really thoughtful. And we'll dive into some of them. But one of the things I want to bounce up just a minute, just to straight leadership.
Okay.
Because I think one of the things we don't talk enough about is, why do we lead, right? What is it? It's hard. It's a hard job. It's been a hard job for a long time. But there are joys in it too. So give the audience just a little bit about the origins and the joys of your leadership journey. And if you have a best day that let you know, oh man, this is totally worth it, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. Well, starting out, I was frequently the only, but I've never been the first woman of anything that I'm tracking. And I think that's a good thing, because I really, really value the second and the third and the fourth. And so I'm not the first A26. I'm the second A26 because, Lieutenant General Dash Jameson paved the way for me. And there's a difference between overcoming a barrier yourself, and I have had to overcome some barriers, and there's a difference between removing the barrier for the people coming behind you. And so, so just this week, I've had a best day, and I got an email from someone who I helped her change an assignment to give her both a career-enhancing opportunity that kept her family together. And this is important. When I went to War College, I had to go with a 16-month-old and 3-year-old as a single parent, because it's a long story. But I didn't want this to happen to another family. And I remember thinking back then, if I'm ever in charge, I'm going to do something. I had a boss that didn't want to do something. So that was a year ago. And it was a little bit of a stretch for her. And she felt it was a stretch for her. I never felt it was a stretch for her. And maybe we'll talk later about my thoughts about imposter syndrome, but she sent me a note. She is finishing this program in the top 10% with a perfect GPA. Her thesis is being nominated for awards in the IC, and she was able to keep her family together. And so to me, removing a barrier that I had to overcome, helping somebody be successful in their career, that brings me joy. And so I have a special folder, and if I get a card or I get an email, and I keep those, because that's what people are like, Mary is still here. That's why I'm still here, because I think I can do more of that now.
General, that's a terrific answer, and I do think that there's something really remarkable about when you're in a leadership position to create systemic opportunity, not just one-off opportunity. So that's a great story. Real quickly, because you have alluded to a couple of the lessons learned along the way, and how those make you a leader. One of those is to take care of those who are coming a long way, take care of their hearts. Give me a couple of other lessons learned of your leadership journey, because it's both been obviously successful and hard won, right? So what are your best lessons learned that you can offer our audience? And then we'll get on and talk about the follow up on some of the things you talked about in your remarks.
Yeah, I think the lesson, to me, the most important lesson that I wish I had learned sooner was it's okay to be who I am. And when the military wants to kind of stamp you, and people say, well, you have to be like this, you have to be charismatic, you have to be, extroverted, you have to be this, you have to, and I listened, I internalized some of that early on, and it affected my original plans, which were spend 5 years in the military and then go do something else. And then eventually, when I thought I'm not staying, that gave me the freedom to say, well, this is who I am. This is the kind of leader I am. I don't want to study that. Everyone's like, you need to study Civil War. I apologize to the history majors out there. I've been to Gettysburg. I don't learn anything from the terrain. I wanted to study, how do you build high performing teams? And that's what I was interested in. And be like, you need to read this book. I don't want to read that book. I want to read the things that I want to read. So to me, I want people to be who they are, because isn't that the whole point of diversity?
Right.
That's the whole point, is be your authentic self and bring your strengths to the team.
Yeah, that's such a one, perfect conclusion, and two, such a great truth. If we had all the senior women that have talked over these 4 days and we had them sitting on a panel and we asked them what is the truism that they had been told that they ignored, it would be a really fun conversation. I think what's true is you have to deliver as a leader. How you deliver is changing by the day. And I think that's one of the really great aspects of diversity and an increasingly diverse leadership team is we're figuring out that excellence doesn't have one look. You still must be excellent, but how you deliver that excellence.
You are so right.
Yeah. So let's jump to the Air Force. You and I could talk forever, but you lead over 70,000, that's a big number, 70,000 Air Force employees today. And you're the top general officer on the Air Force's Women Initiative team. You mentioned that in your remarks. Talk to me about the goal of that initiative team and some of the sub-initiatives underway as part of it.
Yeah, I really am proud of this team. This team has grown from a couple hundred volunteer women. There's no permanent positions on the Women's Initiative team. We now have over 1,000, and it's not just women, it's men and women. And we've organized. General Brown actually said in Corona not too long ago that the Women's Initiative team is one of the most organized, volunteer groups in the Air Force. And so the goal, it was stood up under Secretary James when she created the barrier analysis working groups. And so it is part of one group, that there's others as well. There's the Black and African American, there's a Hispanic, Asian and Pacific Islander, a disability, and a new LGBTQ and Indigenous Native. So I want to make sure that we understand it's not just the Women's Initiative team, it's not the only barrier analysis working group. We have groups across many different backgrounds that are looking at the barriers. But for the Women's Initiative team, what's interesting is we frequently have women that belong to more than one team, because we have women that are on our team that are also African American. We've organized into 9 line of efforts, because again, mostly military people, of course, we're going to organize. Let me share the lines of effort, and then we have specific things under each one of them. The most visible one most recently under our female specialized healthcare policies was the change to the Air Force hair standards. And so because of migraines and traction alopecia, things like that, being able to wear hair down in ponytails or braids. There are other female specialized healthcare policies that they're working on as well, standardizing infertility policies for women who are seeking out privately funded infertility treatment because the TRICARE doesn't pay for that. We have another effort for childcare programs and policies. We'd like to see the stipend that people can receive for going to a private child care center to be able to use that for your own in-home care if you have a live-in nanny or au pair. So we're working on legislative proposals or DoD policies to change those. Removing pregnancy discrimination policies. Previously, if you were pregnant, you couldn't attend the career enhancing opportunities you need for your next promotion, like squadron officer school or things like that. There was a waiver process that was being applied very inconsistently. Also, anthropometrics. Right before he left, Dr. Roper, based on a WIT initiative, signed a memo to the Air Force acquisition community that all future weapon systems would be able to fit the American population that we recruit from the 5th to 95th percentile. So you wouldn't be too short to fly the B-21, things like that. And then education, we're also looking at military and civilian promotion board policies. We stood up when Secretary Austin released his sexual assault tasker. We stood up a LOE for countering sexual assault and harassment, and we're looking at gender neutral language. And we have volunteers in each one of these that are doing amazing things to identify the barriers where we can make policy changes. I am really proud of this group.
Wow, those are fantastic. And as the mother of a former Marine officer who ran into each one of those areas along the way, I don't know that it would be enough for her to change the Air Force, but almost. Those are.
Well, we're coordinating with the Marines and the Army and the Navy. We're bringing some of our WIT groups together.
Yeah, just fantastic. And kind of where I started, the practicality of the approach is really wonderful. So just switching a bit, how is the Air Force prioritizing not only the recruitment of diverse talent, but also the retention of a diverse workforce? And tell us a little bit about some of your innovations in both those arenas.
Yeah, there are definitely, and so of course our A1, Lieutenant General Kelly, as our Director of Personnel, leads a lot of these efforts. But we also have opportunity within our own portfolios. A couple things that we're doing in A26 is we released an ISR and CEO diversity and inclusion strategy. And that strategy includes things like focus groups and kind of specific led conversations. It also includes some leadership development programs. We call it Level Up, valuing everyone equally. And then also allyship that I mentioned, right? How can we make sure that it's inclusive? And we say inclusive, we mean everybody. I'll share that that we don't always get it right the first time. When we first decided that we would stand up the leadership development program, it was only going to be open to women and minorities. And then we got some feedback from women and minorities and majority members that we should look at that again. And then we sought best practices in industry and academia, and that's not the best practice, right? You can't have a diversity inclusion strategy that's excluding people. And so now it has been modified. It will have cohorts of everybody. And so I think that's a really good initiative. I'm looking forward to kicking that off this summer. The other thing that we did is I funded a coaching program. It's kind of a pilot. And again, it wasn't directed at any particular minority group or women, but we had a diverse, we opened it up to a diverse group. And I specifically asked for feedback, should we continue this coaching? And it was for lieutenant colonels and master sergeants and chiefs and colonels, wing commanders, group commanders. One of our group commanders sent me a note, and she is okay with me sharing this, about the value of the coaching program, which I think is going to tie very much into our retention going forward. They started out by talking work-related things, but she's very confident. She knows her job, but that wasn't really where she found what she called the magic. She said the magic happened when we were left to figure out how we we're going to use the rest of the sessions. We started talking about the intersections between being a woman, a military officer, a mom, a spouse, and a human being. In the sessions, we talked about parenting, children's education requirements, organizing our home, communicating at home, communicating at work, communicating with the press. And she's gained a lot. She said through these conversations with her coach, she gained tips and techniques to increase her efficiency in all areas of her life. Where this really matters is, she said, if I had had these skills and this knowledge 10 years ago, I would be in fine-tuning mode as she goes to the next level of leadership instead of preventing burnout. And I just went, that was for me a big aha moment.
Yeah, excellent. All right, Mary, you have inspired so many people to ask questions that I've got a queue full of them.
Oh.
If you'll allow me the privilege of 2 more from me.
Okay.
We'll go short answers because I'm looking at them and they're great ones and we want to get to them. One is, I noted that in previous engagements, you talked about the lessons you've drawn from Chanel Miller's 2019 memoir, Know My Name, which is an account of a sexual assault by a Stanford University student. Could you just briefly tell us why this is such a seminal, impactful work for you and your key takeaway that apply to your work?
Yeah, and so as we know, the military has not been able to reduce the sexual assaults. I was victim as a 23-year-old first lieutenant. I was victim number 24 at Tailhook, which for younger people, you can Google it. And so for 30 years, I've been watching DOD try to address sexual assault, and in some ways having to rely on women telling their story, which can be traumatizing. I found her book to be so powerful, describing what it is like to be a victim of sexual assault, what it's like to try to report, what it's like to try and go through the judicial process, that it would be super helpful if leaders would read it and learn, because I don't want people to have to go through that experience to be able to understand what we need to do to prevent it. And so to me, it was really useful in a way for me to try to get people to think about it without having to share my own experiences.
Yeah, and I'm now you'll know that my words at the top of our session were not false. I'm inspired anew by you. Read the book. It matters as a leader. Okay, let's go to some questions, if you would. And Mary, if we have time, we'll come back to our private conversation that we're having in front of hundreds of our closest friends. The first question is from Jenna Breslow. And by the way, these questions and answers are brought to you courtesy of one of my very favorite partners, Northrop Grumman. Boy, we have aren't we lucky as a national security community to have terrific partners in the private sector like Mantech and Northrop Grumman who help us on our way. Jenna asked you that I like your reference to detitling, I do too. when some people are referred to by their first name instead of by their title or position. And she's pressing on your practicality. She said, what should one do in that situation? Because you don't want to make it a scene in the middle of something, but what do you do when you find yourself in that situation?
Yeah, that is not an easy situation. And very recently, somebody called me Miss Mary in a professional venue multiple times, and I couldn't find the right moment to say, please stop doing that. And so, like it would, I think, and then I said, I'll ask for advice, right? So I did. I went to somebody else and I asked for advice, and it was a man, and he said, well, you should just go talk to him. And I was like, it's not quite that simple. And so what I do is when I see it happening to somebody else, I speak up. I always feel like we should be amplifying each other's voices. So as an individual, one of the things that, women know that they might pay a social penalty by this confrontation. And you have to weigh, and I think women know how to do this. Do I want to pay that social penalty by saying it's Dr. Jones? Do I want to, make a joke like, oh, my 8 years of schooling? Or do you want to let it go? Or if you have an ally, do you want to ask the ally, to perhaps engage? That it is such a tough one, even for me, 35 years in.
Yeah, and Jenna, I think Jenna O'Brien said it really well. It's hard for all of us. I know even I'll be introduced in sessions with the Honorable John Brenner, and the Honorable Jim Clapp, or the Honorable and Sue Gordon. I'm like, right now in conversation, the familiar is just fine, but when the formality, and it is really hard, I'm getting more comfortable going back to organizers to make sure that they have my title and name right. But it's hard, Jenna. I think Mary, General O'Brien said it right, is your first step is to make sure it doesn't happen to somebody else. Check yourself, check that you are insisting that those things in which you're in charge of carry it forward. All right, so we got the question of, back to the topic of male allyship. I love this topic. And can you give the audience some examples of when it's really worked and when you've really seen it make a difference when they leap into the fray?
Absolutely. The Women's Initiative team was working on collecting some data. We make data-driven decisions. We did a survey, and we had 25,000 people respond to address childcare needs for Air Force members. And it wasn't just addressed at the women. I view childcare as a parenting issue, not a maternal issue or mothering issue. And what was super interesting is when we first said we were doing this, they're sort of, oh, that's very interesting. The women are getting together to talk about childcare needs. But, and I have the statistics right over here, the number of men who responded. So there's a lot more men in the military than women. So we had 17,000 male respondents out of the 25,000 to our childcare survey. One of the questions was, will you make a decision on whether to remain in the Air Force based on the availability of childcare? And 30% of the men who responded said childcare would influence their decision to leave the Air Force. And all of a sudden, we had attention.
There are so many things. We could dive into just that topic and just that answer. I also think when women get into leadership positions and you start talking about things like childcare, we really help men who have the same issues, but it's in some ways it's not as socially acceptable for them to talk about it. So that is a incredible advance that you got that many answers to that question from males. All right, so here's just a straight up my favorite question, because I think we all learned so much. Talk to the audience about mentorship in your career. How have you been mentored, and how have you found that experience?
I would say I've had good, and I would call them all good, but good in different ways. There weren't a lot of women to go to, but I did receive professional mentoring from men, right? About how to be a better officer, how to be a better intelligence analyst. But where I needed the help sometime was back to, the magic that from the coaching was once I had my children, which I had in my mid-30s, so I was well into my career, and I went to ask for mentorship because we had been apart. My husband and I had been apart for a couple of years, and whether I would go to Squadron Command. And when I went to ask him, how could I do this? He said, well, why can't you just leave your daughter behind, my 2-year-old daughter? And I said, I said, sir, you've given me a lot to think about. I really appreciate your time. And then, I was never here. And so I think when it comes to mentorship, I've had to look across a diverse group. I think initially we encourage people to find a military member, an Air Force member, but I had to find mentors, civilian mentors in the IC, military spouses that were part of my unit in order to figure out, and what I would find is, hey, can you tell me how we're doing solving time critical targeting? But then if I wanted to know, hey, how can I use TRICARE to help pay for my daughter's braces, right? You need mentoring in a lot of different areas. And the way to do that was to realize that you can't expect one person to be able to mentor in all areas of your life. And once I realized that, I think I had better relationships with my mentors instead of being frustrated that they couldn't help me with all the areas that I felt like I needed someone to give me some guidance.
That's a great answer, and I think it's a point we don't make all that often, as many of the points you've made today. Not all mentoring is about some profound moment in your life. Some of it is just giving you perspective on finding your way with ease. And I would say this is a great area where people can self-mentor. You can form mentoring groups to be able to give advice or give tips on areas of common interest. So I love that. I'm still focusing on leaving your 2-year-old daughter behind, but there's a great point there in that mentoring is offered, that you don't have to take it all in. We have a comment here saying something that I was thinking when you showed it, how much they love the picture you put up of your family, and thanks for sharing it. And the asker reflected that there had been so many comments by panelists over the past few days about the need and challenge of bringing your whole self to work. And you mentioned that a bit too, but could you just dive in a little bit deeper about, kind of how you do that? Because there is this moment that I think we all have, maybe women more than men, but I've never been anyone other than myself, so it's hard to know, where you're always trying to decide how much you want to reveal. right? So give us a little bit more on, you tackled that so clearly in your opening remarks. Give us a little more practical advice on how you do that.
Right. And I want to make sure that I'm honest that early in my career, I think, again, women have, you have to balance the risk. And so what I can do now as a 3-star is different than what I was able to do when I first had my daughter. And I'll give you an example. So I first had my daughter, and my husband was out at sea, and I was working in LL in the Pentagon, where there's a culture of you can get up out of any meeting and go join your carpool, but you can't get up and say, my daycare center is closing. So I joined a carpool, and that carpool allowed me to leave. And I never said, I'm going to get my daughter because my daycare is closing. I said, my carpool is leaving, gotta go. That was the culture then. And so, but I feel an obligation as I became more senior. As a colonel, I had young children, a kindergartner, and my son was in the Three Piggy opera, and he was a wolf. And it was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had put it on my calendar. At 2 o'clock, I'm going to watch my son in the Three Piggy opera. And then I noticed it was marked private. And I came out my front office and I said, hey, what just happened? And I unmarked it private. And then it was marked private again, and we're having this battle. And I came out and I talked to my executive assistant, and I said, hey, what's going on? They go, you don't want people can see your calendar. You don't want people to know that you're going over to the school at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to see the Three Piggy opera. I said, I absolutely do. They see when I have a meeting that starts at 6 o'clock. They see when I come in early. They see when I leave on a Sunday for a TDY that starts on a Monday. I said, I absolutely do want them to see that I am going to watch my son in the Three Piggy opera. And I think the more that senior people do that, it lets the culture start to trickle down in a way that I would not have felt comfortable, back 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think your comments are really good on this. It changes as we get more senior. You start out with the prerogative of the individual to make decisions about how much you want to share, and you end up with the responsibility of a leader to be able to create an environment that sends the right message. And I too would chose to put private things on my calendar so people knew that I had a life. One more question that I have in my queue from the audience, and then I'll close. Oh, I got a couple more. All right. Got one that says, you noted that your high school grades went up when you changed the externals of your responses. Do you have any ideas about how the intelligence community and the Air Force could take some of that and further implement it into our own evaluative processes to continue the effort to even it out?
Yeah, that's a big debate right now we're having. Should we remove the names and gender and racial identity from the performance reports? And there's one school of thought, and I've looked at research on this because I'm very curious. There's one school of thought that if you take that off, that it would result, in more diverse, more fair results. However, there's another school of thought that the person writing it, absolutely knows the gender and race of the person they're writing on. Because of my demographics, I sit on a lot of promotion boards, and I've seen a lot of records over my career. And when there's research out there about the bias in performance evaluations, and I said, I think I could tell a male or female by just one last line. Frequently, I'll see in a woman's report, passionate advocate for airmen, really cares about her people, which is absolutely you need to do for your unit. But in a man's, I'll see, totally revitalize the mission 150%, and you'll see some kind of metric that's related to mission performance. I find that very interesting. And now that I'm sensitized to it, now that I'm paying attention, I see it. And so So I need to think more about that, and I think we as a community need to think. And some of that I learned from some of the bias interrupter tools when it talked about the type of bias to look for in your evaluation processes.
Yep. All right. Alice McKinney asks, what excites you about the future of women in the intelligence community, and how much of a game changer do you think it will be when we have a woman in both the DNI and, if confirmed, in the PDDNI role when Stacy Dixon arrives?
Right. Well, they're both phenomenal women, right? And this is where I don't think it's just because they're women, right? They're phenomenal. And so I'm really looking forward to that because of their qualifications. And I've really enjoyed already working with Director Haynes and the things that she's doing and where she's moving the DNI. So I don't know that I would say it's a game changer because there's two women, other than perhaps, you know, the saying, if you can't be it if you can't see it. And the fact that there's a lot of junior and maybe mid-tier women who say, well, that could be me, right? And so the role model that you now have, which, you know, early on when you're looking around, you're like, oh, I guess this is where I top out. There's nobody that looks like me above me. So I'm excited about it, not because they're women, but because they're both really, really, really exceptional.
Well, awesome. One last question, and I need you to answer it in a tweet, and then I'm going to give you the last word. Janice asks, can you share your advice on how you promote yourself when you know you are equally or potentially more capable and productive than those around you?
Yeah, that's another good one that shows that women who advocate for themselves are viewed as ambitious, and that's not considered to be a good quality in women. And in fact, but women are expected to advocate for others. And so the advice that I give to some of the women who want to go do career enhancing things is in their section, they put, you know, I'm willing to do, you know, this and that, and I'm all in. And then in the senior section is where you really go full force on it. We need this person to do something. And so I don't want to say find someone to advocate for you, but it tends to, my perception, because I still remember somebody saying, I want to command and I want to keep my family together. And we were in a kind of a small group, and somebody said, well, she just wants everything. And I was like, I don't think that's an unreasonable request. Like, you know, why would we hold that against her? But I think you have to go into it with your eyes wide open. And that's, I've always wanted to learn about the bias so that while I'm waiting for it to be the world I hope we live in someday, I can operate effectively inside the world we are actually operating in.
Well, Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien, I think I speak for the whole audience when I say that you're amazing, humble, accomplished, productive, passionate, focused on not only the mission of your unit, but advancing the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a really inspiring way. So I'm incredibly honored to have had this time with you. And because I think so highly of you, I'm going to give you the last word before we turn it back over to John.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to say thanks to the people who are attending. I am so grateful for the interest, for the growing interest, and the willingness to have these conversations. I feel a lot less lonely in this space. And so I really appreciate the opportunity. And Sue, you've been much too kind. Thank you.
All right, John, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sue. And wow, General O'Brien, thank you so much for being our guest today. And Sue, you as well. and for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm ready to keep the conversation going at tonight's networking reception, which will be at Grand Cru in Arlington. We hope that everyone will be able to join us there from 5 o'clock to 6:30 this evening. And as a reminder, I also want to let you know that all registered attendees will get links to recording of each day's programming next week. So you can use these links to catch up on anything you may have missed this week, or to share with others and share your favorite moments with your colleagues. Looking ahead, tomorrow we close out the week-long program with a fireside chat featuring sisters. Julianne Galena, who's the CIO of CIA, and her sister Chris Lovejoy, Global Head of Cybersecurity for Ernst & Young. They will share their experiences about rising to the top in male-dominated fields and the importance of strong female role models. So this concludes today's program. Stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful day. We look forward to welcoming you back at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and we hope to see you this evening at 5. Take care.